I can feel it. For 5 cents.
Sorry?
It's ready.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'll just go to the restroom.
Okay. All right.
But this one you want me here? I think you have to move that around so that it stops the swelling from going in there, or it's slowing down anyway. But March 10th, April 10th, it's been almost 2 months and I can still.
the restroom. He'll be back. your your talk went really good. The PowerPoint was good.
It was perfectly well.
You had a packed room.
It did. It got full. Yeah, of course. Back room there is not even half this.
I know.
But still, yeah.
I know. Yeah.
You're going to do this, Anil. Don't let the tomatoes get dry. Okay. I will. And we don't make empty promises. Okay. But then you'll conduct the question answer. Yeah. If I have one.
I can help
Indoor.
if you need to.
We'll have him pick who can ask questions.
Great idea.
Organize it. Yeah. That's fine.
There you go.
Okay. Is he back?
I'll be back in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had a great compliment in the session before. Really? It was so sweet what you said. That yeah, it was recorded. So sweet.
I did that way with 3 other ladies, and they said there's no room there.
Yeah, it got full. Yeah.
You cannot even stand. So we had to see a wife to turn around. But I was very happy to be with the school kids. So that was fun. But I'm sorry.
No, no, no.
Just push it all the way up. You know it. Okay. Okay. He's giving his prayer. Here's Paul.
You have to take anything Yap says. There's not a grain of salt, like a truckload of salt. Truckload of salt.
Oh, I know. I don't even.
And all his ancestors and his
Oh, his
descendants
hands are slow.
from now,
too much.
here,
Too
forward.
much. Too much.
Right? What do you say? What do you say? Yeah. She's just sort of innocent bystander who got dragged into this whole
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
thing. She has an eminently sensible head. Moment of weakness and poor judgment. It's rare. Probably nice. But no, it decided to come to this end. Oh, there he is. Okay, we have power. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get started, and it is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anil Ananthaswamy, who's going to talk to us about the man who wasn't there, neurophysiological conditions and what they tell us about who we are. So Anil has an interesting background. He grew up in India and trained as a computer scientist, graduating from one of the Indian Institutes of Technology, and then worked in the area of software for many years. Was it about 10? And he'd always been interested in diverse areas of science, and he'd also, in parallel, been interested in writing. And so he joined a writing program at UC, was it Santa Cruz? And then became a science writer, and he currently writes primarily for a magazine, New Scientific, which is one of the oldest scientific magazines in the world. It's based in London, but he writes columns and pieces for other outlets as well. He researches and does books. This is his second book, The Man Who Wasn't There. His first book was about physics, and he's probably working on 3 or 4 other books as we speak, at least one. So Anil.
Thank you, Pratik, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure for me to be speaking here. For those of you who were here last week on the conference on reflections on the self, I must warn you that this talk is exactly the same. Even the jokes are going to be the same. So if you don't want to be bored a second time around, I suggest there are other things happening. But if you think you're going to learn anything more by sitting around, you're welcome to stay. As Pratik said, this is The Man Who Wasn't There is the title of my last book. And I want to speak about some of the things that I learned about during the course of the writing of the book. And the structure of the talk is pretty much the way I structured what I wrote. The talk is going to be about the human sense of self and what neuropsychological conditions, and we'll come to talk about exactly what they are, but neuropsychological conditions that change how we feel about ourselves. So each of these conditions perturbs our sense of self in some particular way, and the idea is to ask ourselves what can they tell us about the human sense of self. When we talk of the human sense of self, I think we all intuitively know what that means. When you wake up, it's there. When you fall asleep, it disappears, comes back in our dreams. It's also this sense we have of being a body here and now, and also of an entity that, or someone or something that seems to exist over time. This entity that goes back to your earliest memories, and also an entity that you can imagine 10 years hence. So all of these things go towards constituting our sense of self. And the question is, when you just say it like that, it doesn't seem to be anything mysterious. We kind of know what it is. But actually, it's a big mystery. And I want to, let me just see if this works. Perfect. This is a quote from philosopher Thomas Nagel, who says it rather nicely and poetically, and I just want to read that out. It seems outlandish that the centerless universe, in all its spatio-temporal immensity, should have produced me of all people. There was no such thing as me for ages, but with the formation of a particular physical organism at a particular place and time, suddenly there is me, for as long as the organism survives. How can the existence of one member of one species have this remarkable consequence? And in a sense, that's really the mystery, right? And when philosophers, theologians, and these days neuroscientists start wondering about these questions, this particular question, they are actually thinking about a few very specific things. And I just want to start by talking about what is it about being a self that bothers them or makes them think about things and makes them want to come up with answers. And so the first thing is something called synchronic unity. This is a term they use to explain a certain phenomena about being a human, or which is that right now each one of you is hearing me speak, is looking at me speak. You're also aware of your bodily sensations. Some of you will be feeling comfortable in your chairs, others maybe not so much. All of these sensations are being experienced by the same entity, right? You don't have a feeling that one entity is hearing the sounds, another entity is getting the visual input, yet another entity is feeling the tactile sensations. No, your internal experience of being what you are right now is unified. All of the sensations are being experienced by the same entity at this moment in time. And philosophers call this synchronic unity. There is another kind of unity that we experience, which is this experience of, if you think back to some earlier memory of yourself, say when you were 4 years old, maybe for me, probably later because I just can't remember things that far back. But say, whatever memory you choose to recall, or if you try to imagine yourself a few years from now, those things also bring up thoughts, perceptions, emotions, etc. But they're all felt as if they're being experienced again by the same entity. The entity that I'm using the word entity because I don't want to say the same person, because we'll come to why these distinctions matter. But again, there is a unity of experience over time. You don't feel as if the 4-year-old self was being experienced by something else, someone else, and the future self will be someone else. No, there is this sense that the same entity is experiencing everything that's happening to it, whether it was in the past or in some imagined future, or all the things that are happening right now. Right? So this is the second thing, is called diachronic unity, the unity that spans time. Now you can imagine why people who are thinking about these things would start feeling like, okay, there must be something that has the experience of all of these things happening to itself, and hence makes us, each one of us, feel like we are a self that exists over time. Right? So that's their target of inquiry. And so naturally, these when you think of these things like that, these questions come up. Is there a self or not? Right? Can the self exist independently of all else? Which means, does the self have the same status in the universe of things as, say, material objects do? Right? If you decompose all these material objects, including our brains and bodies, into their fundamental constituents, you will end up with electrons and quarks and gluons and fields, and so the basic constituents of the material world. Does the self have the same status alongside these material things? Right? Suppose all of us were right now dissolved, were to be dissolved into our material constituents. Would the material stuff be there plus all these individual selves? It's a question, right? That's the kind of questions people start asking, which mean in philosophy they would say, does the self have an independent ontological status? Does it make up, is it one of the constituents of the fundamental things that make up the universe? You would probably have heard the term that the self is an illusion, right? This comes up routinely, especially in popular literature about the self. And the question there to ask is, if the self is an illusion, then whose illusion is it? Right? So keep these questions in mind as we proceed. And when these kinds of questions come up, there are philosophers, theologians, etc., who would have thought about it, given answers. And this is an example of the kind of answer someone would have come up. This is a very famous quote from Scottish philosopher David Hume. And it reads, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." Right? So Hume is what's called today, he's referred to as a bundle theorist. The idea that all we are is a bundle of perceptions, and if you were to start looking for what is it that actually experiences these perceptions, there is no center. Right? It's the bundle of perceptions give rise to the appearance of a center, but if you were to dismantle all the perceptions, there is nothing there. And so he has one answer to the question, who am I, which is basically nothing but a bundle of perceptions. And hence, and so on and so forth. There are lots of different answers from different religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, and strains. There are answers from within Hinduism. Different sects would have different ways of looking at it. Western philosophy, Western theology, all of them have posited answers to the question, who am I? So what I want to do is to start in this talk, take us into neuroscience. So if you pose the question to neuroscience, who am I? What is neuroscience going to say? And one way of doing that is by taking a look at certain sort of neuropsychological conditions, and we'll come to that. I just wanted to give you a brief idea of what psychologists and others have been thinking about when they sort of start thinking about the self. These are facets of the self, or the way the self can be thought of, and the categorization comes from the American psychologist William James. So one categorization he had was to divide the self, or sense of self, into three categories. The material me, which is everything that belongs to the, when you say I or me or mine, all of that falls into the so-called material me. he also said we are a social self. Now, a social self is that aspect of our sense of self which depends on interactions with others. So, which means that there are as many social selves within us as there are interactions, right? So, no two interactions is going to make you feel the same way. So, each particular interaction has a certain feeling within you. So, if you're interacting with your parents, you feel a certain way, with your children, different way, friends differently, etc. So, every interaction will give rise to a different feeling of being a self, and so there are as many social selves as there are interactions. And he also identified something called the spiritual self, which is just a person's inner faculties and thoughts. And as we go along, you'll see that these are pretty arbitrary distinctions. You can slice and dice the self any which way, and you'll come up with a whole bunch of ways of looking at it. Another categorization, which actually is much more useful, also due to William James, he said the self is, there are two kinds. One is the implicit self, and the other one is the explicit self. The implicit self is a self that we all are as soon as we are born, probably before we are born in the fetus, which is, or rather in the as a fetus, which is this sense of being something to which experiences are happening without requiring reflection, without requiring language to talk about it, without requiring thought and cognition. Babies have this, right? And the other way of looking at the self is there is another component of the self, which is the explicit self, which actually requires thought, which requires you to reflect upon who you are. It requires language to talk about. So all of those things that require cognition, thinking, recollection, talking about, form what can be called the explicit self, right? So this, again, categorizations. There was a paper by a philosopher called Galen Strawson when he started looking at how many ways in which people have been, partitioning the self. I think the maximum number he came up was something like 28. So really tells you that you can choose exactly what aspect of the sense of self you want to talk about. There are many, many different ways. In my book, I kind of focused on a slightly different distinction. And this is the narrative self and the bodily self. So the narrative self is probably the thing that we're most familiar with in a manner of speaking, which is that if somebody asked you, who are you, you will give them a narrative answer. You're going to tell them a story about your lives, right? You're going to say, you were born here, you did this, you did that. The kind of introduction that Pathik was giving about me. Now he was telling a story, admittedly a very small story, but nonetheless a story. And that's a narrative self. That's also called the autobiographical self or the cognitive self. And this is a story not just something that we tell others, but it's something we tell ourselves. With that, implicitly, it goes on within our minds about who we are. And again, you can imagine that your narrative self can be very different depending on circumstances. So the stories that we are also changing according to the environment, the social environment that we are living within. The other thing is the bodily self. Now, all of you at this moment are likely feeling embodied. You feel like you are in your body, not up on the ceiling, hopefully. And that we all have a sense of being embodied, being in a certain location where the body is situated. We identify with our bodies. These might seem all very trivial statements to make, but when we start talking about these neuropsychological conditions, you'll realize that all of these things can come apart, right? So the idea of being a bodily self, the fact that I'm standing here, that I feel identified with this body, not someone else's body, the idea that I have a first person perspective, which means I look out at the world from behind my eyes, and I have the sense that whatever I'm experiencing is private to me, that I can't experience what any of you are experiencing, and vice versa, right? So that's all part of what goes into making the bodily self. And these are kind of two very coarse distinctions you can make about what the sense of self is made of: the narrative, the bodily self. And as it happens, a lot of these, these aspects of the self that we are talking about, they start coming apart in different conditions. And by asking questions about what comes apart and what neuroscience tells us about what's happening in the brain and body, we can maybe get a sense for how our self or how our sense of self is actually put together to more or less work seamlessly most of the time. So let's start. So these are the, some of these conditions you may be familiar with, some you may not, and I'll touch upon them. I won't have time to go through all of them, which I sort of admonition that I didn't keep in mind the last time, and I think I went half an hour over, so I'm going to be very careful today. But Alzheimer's disease, again, how many in this room know people who are suffering from Alzheimer's? Yeah, so a few people. And this is a devastating condition. At the very end of Alzheimer's, the person with Alzheimer's essentially has lost all memory and has lost the ability to recognize loved ones, relations, friends, etc., has lost cognitive abilities to such an extent that he or she is unable to take care. Patients are unable to take care of themselves, and really, it's quite debilitating, to the point that caregivers who are looking after patients with Alzheimer's often use the language to say things like, "The person I knew is no more. There is no one in there." So implying a kind of loss of self. Loss of sense of self, right? The question is how accurate is that, and what is Alzheimer's telling us about the nature of the self? The first thing that happens, if you have been around people with Alzheimer's, especially in the early to middle stages, when they're still able to converse, they're still able to talk about who they are. If you meet someone with mid-stage Alzheimer's, and you start talking to them about who they are, they will be telling you. They'll have a story in their heads about who they are, and if you did not really know what their real story is, you would think that, it sometimes doesn't make sense, but yeah, that might be it. But if you actually know their life story, then you'll realize that a lot of the times the story that they're narrating to you is scrambled up. So now what is a narrative? What is a story? A story is essentially a sequence of episodes strung together in time, right? In a very simple way of speaking. We are all such narratives. We have episodes in our head, memories of episodes in our head that are strung together to create kind of hopefully a seamless story about who we are. But that can get scrambled. And the reason why it happens is, one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's in the very beginning stages is loss of short-term memory. So they will do something or experience something, and 5 minutes later there'll be no recollection of exactly the thing that happened. Now, when you think about what a narrative self is, how does a narrative self form? Now, if none of us right now here have problems with short-term memory, hopefully the experience of this event will eventually transpose itself into long-term memory. It will enter long-term memory. It will become an episode in our lives, and it will become part of our narrative self. Depending on the situation later down the road, you might be able to recall this event and say, "Oh, I was in Ohio at such and such a time, and I heard this talk," etc. Right? Now, imagine if you lost, for whatever reason, short-term memory. This event doesn't get incorporated into your long-term memory, and then essentially it's not part of your narrative self. There's no way to recall this event if it didn't enter your long-term memory, which it wouldn't if you had no way of forming short-term memories. So that's what's happening in Alzheimer's. So when the disease onset begins, their narrative self essentially stops growing. So the story that they are kind of comes to a halt, and then eventually, as Alzheimer's progresses, unfortunately, the disease goes to other parts of their store of memories and starts scrambling it. So whatever the mechanism in our brains that needs to put together these episodes in a coherent sort of fashion starts getting affected. But what Alzheimer's does, also from our perspective of understanding the nature of the self, is that it really challenges certain philosophical notions of what the self is. There have been philosophers who have said that all we are is the narrative self. Like, if you take away the narrative, that there is no one left, right? If you take away the stories. The other thing that philosophers have said, not all, but some, is that all we are is the narrative self, but also that the narrative self is purely cognitive, that it requires thought and memory and recollecting our stories. Alzheimer's is beginning to challenge those things. The first thing is that when the narrative starts going away, when the narrative starts getting scrambled, or towards the end stages where the person is actually unable to communicate to you about who they are, the question remains as to, is it fair to say that there is no one in there, that even though they have lost their story, is it fair to say that they are not someone sitting and experiencing, feeling hunger, feeling pain, whatever sensations that might be happening in their body as their own? It's entirely unclear, because unfortunately one is unable to, they are unable to communicate that feeling back to us. So when people say there is no one in there, etc., that's always from the outside. They haven't communicated. If they're able to communicate by, it implicitly means that they are still in there. But because they're unable to communicate, caregivers from the outside make the assumption that there is no one in there. Admittedly, their story is gone. The narrative self has been really disrupted, sometimes destroyed. But the question as to, is there someone in there, that's still an open question. The other thing that Alzheimer's challenges is this idea that the narrative self is simply just cognition, that it requires memory and thinking. Because there are philosophers now, social scientists now, who are beginning to argue that a lot of what we are is embodied, that it doesn't require conscious recall. There's a story about the American composer Aaron Copland. How many of you know about him? Right. So he had Alzheimer's. Towards the end stages, he was really having trouble recalling things, etc. But the story goes that if you let him conduct his orchestra, he could conduct his, what was his signature orchestral piece, the Appalachian Spring. He could do that. Yet he couldn't tell you where he was. So it was a demonstration of the fact that this ability to conduct his orchestra was fully embodied. It did not require conscious cognitive recall. This is not to say that it didn't require the brain. There are lots of things happening in our brain that are working in really close concert with the body that don't enter, conscious thought. So in his case, his ability to conduct the orchestra was embodied, and it, at least towards the mid to late stages of Alzheimer's, it was functioning. Even that goes away eventually in end stage Alzheimer's. So the question remains, who or what is left once the narrative is gone, both the cognitive narrative and the embodied narrative, right? So, and the question we ask from the perspective of the self is, am I my narrative? And the I here, I'm not referring to the person as a whole. Obviously, when we talk of each of us in a holistic sense, yes, we are our narrative and we are our body and all those things. The I that I'm referring to here is, what is the thing that experiences? What is the thing that experiences either being a narrative self or either being a scrambled narrative self, like happens in middle stage Alzheimer's, or potentially what is the I that experiences simply bodily sensations once the entire narrative is gone in end stage Alzheimer's? We don't know the answer to that, right? But just keep that in mind. So the question, am I my narrative? Is the experiencing self, is the thing that experiences everything the narrative? Alzheimer's is kind of telling you, no, there is still an experiencing self, something to which things happen, which is not the narrative, because the narrative can get scrambled and the narrative can go away, and potentially there is still someone there. You can start asking similar questions now. You get the drift of the questions we're going to ask. Am I my body parts? Now this might seem like an extremely silly and trivial question. You'll say, of course I'm my body. My body parts are mine. You may not say I am my body parts, but you will definitely say my body parts are mine, right? You look at your hand, there is an implicit feeling that this hand is mine. I don't even have to question it. It actually seems a very silly question to ask. But as it happens, there are people who unfortunately feel, some people from a very young age, from going back to their earliest memories, who feel that some body part, it usually happens to be the extremity of a limb, like a part of a leg, part of an arm, that doesn't feel like theirs. Now this starts then making us ask questions about, okay, what does that mean? What I don't even know what that means, because as far as I'm concerned, every part of my body feels like mine. I don't even know what that foreign feeling might be like. But there are ways to understand what this might be. How many of you have heard about this condition, body integrity identity disorder? Very few, just 2 or 3 people, right? How many of you have heard of phantom limbs? Much greater proportion, right? So, and the reason for that is phantom limbs are actually, A, they have been in the news for much longer, but B, they're much easier to comprehend in terms of what might be happening. And what is a phantom limb? A phantom limb is something that you experience when, for whatever reason, for whatever medical reason, you might have had an amputation. Say you had your leg was amputated. Some people will continue feeling the presence of that leg long after the limb is gone, long after the physical limb is gone, right? Some people, even a smaller proportion of those people, will even feel pain in that limb. But that is clearly telling you that what they are feeling, what they are perceiving, is not objective reality, because objective reality clearly shows that their limb is no more, right? So they've had an amputation, but they continue to feel the presence of a limb. They continue to sometimes feel pain in that limb. It's a very clear indication that what you perceive, in every one of us, each one of us right now, the body that we perceive is a representation of the body in the brain. So what we take completely for granted as if we are perceiving physical reality is actually not so. What you're perceiving is a map of the body that exists in the brain, and if everything is working well, as it should, then the map and the physical body are congruent, that they should match up with each other. Like, for instance, if I move my arm, I can close my eyes, move my arm, and I know exactly where my arm is. I don't have to look at it, I know. The reason I know is because there are receptors in joints and tendons and muscles that are constantly feeding information back to the brain, and the brain is constructing a map which is dynamic, it's changing. I can put my hands behind my back and I know exactly where it is, right? And the reason is that the maps are changing. Sometimes, like in the case of phantom limbs, the maps don't match up to what the body actually is. So in the case of phantom limbs, the limb is gone, but the map is there. And this is what a neuropsychologist that I met in Switzerland, a wonderful researcher called Peter Brugger, he came up with this way of thinking about what phantom limbs are. He called it animation without incarnation. The limb is animated in your mind, the maps are active in your brain, and hence animated in your mind, but the limb is not incarnate anymore. It doesn't have physical reality. This allows us a way to think about what BIID is. It's the opposite, sort of, which is incarnation without animation, right? Which means that the limb is physically incarnate. It's there. It's perfectly fine, physiologically healthy, everything, but for some reason, it doesn't have the same animated characteristic within your mind. So you actually don't feel as if that limb is yours. And this can be, you can imagine, very, very traumatic for people who are suffering from it, to the point that they will actually go and get the leg amputated or the arm amputated. It's hard to kind of comprehend what that might feel like, but having talked to the people who suffer from it, their suffering is real. And there are questions as to whether it's neurological, in the sense that it comes about because there's been some mismatch in the developmental process between the physical body and the maps in the brain, or is it something that has happened due to environmental inputs? It's hard to disentangle that when you're just putting someone in a scanner at age 40 to see how their brain looks different because they have this condition. It's hard to tell from one scan what their life history is. But there are neurological differences in the brain to do with those areas of the brain that map the body in patients compared to controls, right? So the bigger question for understanding the notion of the self is, am I the thing that experiences my body parts? And again, the answer is clearly no, because you can be someone who experiences ownership of all your body parts, or you can be someone who can experience body parts that don't feel like they belong to you, right? So that I, the experiencing self, is clearly not just the sense of ownership of body parts. We're still not saying what I might be or what I is. This is just posing the question. You're kind of teasing apart various aspects of ourself, right? Jaime? You can ask the same thing about another aspect of ourselves which seems very, very implicitly like our own, which is our thoughts. Am I my thoughts? Am I the agent of my actions? So like right now, when I click this clicker and the slide moves, I just assume I did it. It's entirely possible that Jaime is clicking out there just to make sure that it moves, and I'm clicking this out here thinking I'm controlling that. But if it moves as soon as I click it, then I get the impression that I did it, right? And that's true of anything you might do. You can pick up a glass of water and implicitly you feel like you picked up the glass of water, that you picked up the glass of water. Now again, this seems like a very silly thing to be picking apart, but again, in schizophrenia, for a lot of people with schizophrenia, this sense of agency, the fact that they do something and it doesn't feel like they did it, is a problem, right? And sense of agency is disrupted in schizophrenia. And philosophers, again, when it comes to understanding the self, a lot of philosophers over time have argued that it's because we have a sense of agency, because we feel like we are the agents of our actions, that the sense of being a person, the sense of being an I comes about, right? And schizophrenia is sort of questioning that, because there are people who will, with schizophrenia, who will do an action like change the channel on a television set using a remote. It changes, just like, if I click the clicker and the slide moved, but they don't have the feeling that they did it. And the reason, maybe we don't have time. If we have time, I'll come back to why the neurobiological mechanisms that explain why that happens. But the key thing is that there is something about the way the brain works that has to take every action that we do and refer it back to the self. It has to make it feel like it's mine. And some part of that process has been disrupted in schizophrenia, so that they can do something, it doesn't feel like they did it. The same thing holds for their thoughts, right? So this begs the question, we all have thoughts and our thoughts feel like our own, but what would it feel like if you had a thought in your head and it didn't feel like your own? Again, if it's not something you experience, there's no way to know what that feels like. But there are people who will tell you that that's exactly how sometimes thoughts in their heads feel like, that it is somebody else's, that it doesn't have that feeling of mindness, right? Everything that we are right now has a feeling of mindness, but for them, thoughts don't have those feelings. They have voices in their heads. I would suspect that many people here hear voices in their heads, but at least those voices feel like they're your voice, right? But in schizophrenia, even that changes. They can have voices in their heads that feel, again, like somebody else's. Now, once you know that these are happening, that there are mechanistic neurobiological explanations for why this is happening, you can start understanding the sort of variety of downstream consequences. Imagine you did something and it didn't feel like you did it. What would be your first kind of rational conclusion? Oh, somebody else is making me do it, right? It's the beginning of paranoia, because if consistently things in your head feel like they're not your own, you will start thinking somebody is putting thoughts into my head, somebody is making me do certain things, etc., etc. And it can get very, very difficult for them. They enter, they get into psychosis, which is a completely altered sense of reality about what's out there, etc., right? So, again, from the perspective of the self, is the self that experiences thoughts, or is the self that experiences the agency of being, doing something? Am I my thoughts? Am I the agent of my actions? The answer clearly is no, right? I can have thoughts, I'm speaking in general now, I can have thoughts that feel like mine, but I can also have thoughts, which schizophrenia tells us is possible. I can have thoughts that don't feel like mine. There is still an I that experiences both conditions. Similarly, there can be an I that experiences being the agent of something I do and not feeling like I'm the agent of that action, right? So the I is not quite the sense of agency. The I is not quite all the thoughts put together. There's something more than that. I'm going to skip a couple of slides just to give you an idea. Depersonalization disorder, you can apply the same analysis to emotions, right? Right now, if you are fully present and embodied, you identify very closely with your emotions. You feel like your emotions are you. Turns out in depersonalizations, that's not true. They can feel separated from their own emotions, from their own bodies, own body states. So you can start answering the question about, am I my emotions? And again, the I, the experiencing I, is not the emotions. Autism, I'm going to skip because this is also a very complex condition that needs a lot of unpacking, but you can ask the question about the social self, because people with autism unfortunately have lots of trouble with relating socially to others, and that tells you a little bit about the nature of the social self. This is not to say that a child with autism is not experiencing whatever he or she is experiencing. Of course they are. Their social self might be different, but it's still a kid experiencing whatever it is that the altered self, social self might be. So the I is not the social self, right? So, this is now repetitive in terms of the kinds of analysis we can do, but that's exactly what these conditions are telling us. Am I my body? Now 5 to 10% of a population in general should have had an out of body experience. So I would imagine about 5 of you should have had an out of body experience. Is that how many of you? Ooh, more than 5. We are in Ohio, so it must be more than 5. So yes. So maybe people with out of body experiences end up coming here, and then but again, it's not as uncommon as one might think. But what is an out of body experience? These phenomena come under the general term autoscopic phenomena. So one form of that is you will hear accounts of, especially accounts from people who are under stress, which has more to do with the kinds of stress that, say, mountaineers would feel when they're climbing mountains and are oxygen deprived. If you read accounts of the Antarctic explorers during the, when they're exploring Antarctica, especially Shackleton's reports, there are these extraordinary accounts of 3 of them trekking over vast distances in order to go find help so that they could help their comrades who were stranded on the ice. And for days on end, they're walking, and all 3 of them would talk about how they felt the presence of a 4th person, right? So, even otherwise, there will be people who will report that I sense a presence. Now, a neurologist in Switzerland gave me a very nice way of thinking about it. Just like you can experience a phantom limb, a limb that is not there, you can experience a body that's not there. Because finally, what you're experiencing is a map of the body in your brain. You can imagine somehow, for whatever reason, a duplicate map has been formed, and you're experiencing that duplicate map. So a presence of a body next to you is like a phantom body. It's like an entire body that's actually not there, but the way the brain puts together our sense of being embodied, being in this body, also makes it possible that sometimes those computations that it needs to do, and I'll come to that, allows it to make mistakes. Not allows it, it makes mistakes, and one of the mistakes is creating another body map that ends up being somewhere next to you, and you feel the presence of that, right? So the other kind of autoscopic phenomenon is something called doppelganger effect, which actually can. So the presence of another body next to you, while it can be frightening, is probably not functionally debilitating. But in the case of doppelganger effect, it can actually be very scary and really, make you do things that will be dangerous to you. And what a doppelganger effect is, you perceive another you in front of you, next to you, but that another you is fully you, and it has an emotional state that you are aware of. And I'm using these words actually start getting confusing, because you're saying, oh, there's another me out there, and I can sense that another me's emotional state. And sometimes when the doppelganger effect is sort of really full on, your sense of being in a body also switches from being in the physical body to being in the illusory body. So you can see the world from either from within your perspective that you're used to, or from the perspective of this illusory self that has somehow appeared in front of you. And it turns out the explanation for this has to do with what our brains need to do in order to make us feel like we are in this body, right? Now that's again something we take for granted. We never question the fact that, as I walk around, this I, whatever that is also moving with the body, right? Seems like a silly question to ask. But just like my brain has to make calculations all the time to let me know that my arm is behind me, it has to actually keep track of this body as it's moving. Those maps are getting, reconfigured as you're moving, and it has to locate the sense of I within the framework of the body map that it has. And it's doing that literally moment by moment. Like as I'm snapping my fingers, it's snapping my fingers, right? And so it has to create these coordinates for the sense of I as being behind our eyes, inside our skull. It has to create sort of a representation of this body in space, a certain volume. We all feel like we occupy a certain volume in space. And create a sense of first-person perspective, what I mentioned to you before, that we all have this feeling that we are perceiving the world from behind our eyes. And that's a computation that's happening literally moment by moment, much for many times a second. And the way the brain seems to be doing that is it's taking all the information that's coming from the outside, external senses, and that's something called exteroception. And there's also information coming from within our body, which we are not usually aware of. Like, it has information about blood pressure, about the temperature of the insides of our body, which we don't have any way of kind of sensing, unless, for instance, your heart starts beating really fast, and then you kind of wake up and say, oh, my heart is beating really fast. But by and large, we're not aware of our heartbeats. We're definitely not aware of our blood pressure or the state of our internal organs, but the brain is. And all of that information is coming into the brain, and it has to integrate all this information somehow to create a sense of being a body. And this integration process can go wrong. And when things go wrong, you get these autoscopic phenomena. And these are not mysterious. There have been, they feel mysterious, obviously. If it happened to any one of us, we'll probably freak out until you get used to it, and then I don't know how it feels, but I don't even know how it feels, even once. So, but the thing to appreciate here is that it's not so much that the out-of-body experience happened, but the fact that we have an in-body experience all the time, right? That is actually quite amazing, that the brain is doing that really every moment, right? The fact of being in-body is the miracle, not the fact that you leave and end up on the ceiling. So the last kind of outer body experience is literally that, where the sense of the eye leaves the body and is able to perceive the body ostensibly from a different vantage point, right? So people will say that, oh, I can view my body lying lifeless on the bed from somewhere near the ceiling. So what has changed is that the sense of an eye, that the brain has to work hard at locating within the geometric confines of the body that it has mapped, sometimes goes wrong, and you can have the illusion of being outside the body because the eye has been located. The brain also has a model of this entire room, for instance. It's everything that you're perceiving all the time, it's actually modeling as you're moving. And so it has coordinates for everything. And it can miscalculate and put the eye, we still don't know what that eye is, right? So that eye can be miscalculated and put in a location, geometric location that doesn't fit with the physical body, and then you can have the experience of being outside the body, right? So the real sort of understanding we are getting from looking at out-of-body experiences are to explain why we have in-body experiences all the time, right? And the larger thing out here is, am I my body? I, in this case, just being the thing that experiences. The classic out-of-body experience, which kind of can locate the sense of the eye, up near a ceiling, is clearly telling you, no, I'm not my body. There is still something else to be explained, right? What is that thing that experiences either being inside the body or outside the body, right? What is that I? And so the question starts getting finer and finer. Am I one with the universe? Well, how many of you know of a condition called ecstatic epilepsy? Just one person. Yeah, it is extremely rare. I'm not surprised. It's a condition. It is an epileptic seizure that happens. It's what's called a focal seizure, which means that only a very small part of the brain is affected by the seizure. Normally, when we think of epileptic seizures, these are what are called grand mal seizures, where the seizure overwhelms pretty much the entire cortex and you fall unconscious. This is not like that. It's a very specific kind of seizure, localized to a specific part of the brain. And what happens when people have an ecstatic seizure, they start reporting these kinds of experiences. There is a very heightened sense of their own body, in terms of how well they kind of are aware of their own body and of the environment. The colors get really vivid, the sounds are heightened, There's also a feeling of bliss and mental and physical well-being. These are subjective reports, so this is how they talk of what it feels like. There's a feeling of time slowing down. They also report feelings of certainty that, right now, if we were to look around the room, we don't have any particular sense of certainty. It's not like, we don't even know what that means, right? Probably most of us are a little bit anxious, fidgeting, wondering about coffee, etc., right? And it's a natural state for us to be in. That is how the body and mind always feel. Like there's just something is off kilter all the time. In ecstatic epilepsy, that's not the case. You can look at the same room right now. If any one of you had a seizure right now, you would think, oh my God, this is just as it should be. There must be a divine sanction to make it feel like that, right? Now, there are, again, neurobiological mechanisms that are beginning to explain why we don't feel that certainty all the time, and why during a seizure that certainty comes about. And again, if we have time, we can talk about it, but let me go through the other big issue here, which is paradoxically, they also, even though they are really aware of their own body, which means they're really aware of their own self, the bodily self, they also paradoxically say that they have lost some kind of boundary with the other. They feel like they've become one with something larger, right? So that is paradoxical, because on one hand they're claiming, oh, I really feel my boundaries, which is the bodily boundaries, but there's something else that has changed, right? Do these descriptions remind you of anything? They remind us of mystical experiences. Now, this is not to say that a mystic is having a seizure, but I just want you to remember, right? Because there are other issues, to do with being someone who can function while you're having these kinds of feelings, which is a separate issue. But this is exactly what is the phenomenology of a mystical experience. And if you talk to, like, one of the sources that I interviewed for my book, he eventually became a philosopher. So he started having these experiences when he was in college. He was studying math, and because of his seizures, he was unable to really concentrate in his exams for math, because you had to remember things and go and write the exam, and he wasn't doing very well. But the philosophy exams he did really well, because he could come back. They could come back to their rooms and write essays, and they were allowed to refer to things. Right? So he ended up studying philosophy and became a philosopher, an analytic philosopher. But what's interesting was he would say that, look, when I was having the seizure, and the seizure would last like a second or two, it would feel like it lasted 30 minutes or 1 hour. They kind of lose the sense of time. And again, there are explanations for why that happens. But what he would say was, when it was happening, I really felt like everything was exactly as it should be, that it really felt like it was divinely sanctioned. And then he would come out of his seizure, and he's an atheist, and he would say, okay, that was my seizure. I would insist that there was nothing divine about it, but he would at the same time insist that you could not have convinced me of that when I was having the seizure, right? The certainty that he felt while having a seizure was so profound that, atheist or otherwise, when he was experiencing that, that's how it felt. The other thing that made him realize that this was a seizure was he was studying in Michigan, in Kalamazoo, and when he would have the seizure, he would be walking around campus thinking, oh, everything is so beautiful, and he would snap out of it, and he would realize that it was a seizure because he was in Kalamazoo, and he said, it's not pretty, right? Now, this is not a knock against Kalamazoo. I have no idea what it's like. Those were his words, so apologies to anyone from Kalamazoo. Right, so the question this brings up is what dissolves to make them feel. There are some rather elegant explanations for why they have this incredible perceptual experience. Psychedelics do this too, exactly this, right? I'm not going to ask how many of you have had magic mushrooms or being high. I'm not going to ask that question. But really, you can read Aldous Huxley writing about having taken mescaline, and it's not very different, except he probably had it for 4 hours, and this is literally a second or two. The explanation seems to be that all of the brain's resources during the seizure go into that part of the brain that creates our sense of bodily self, the thing that is integrating the sensations, both internal and external, hence the vividness of the experience, hence the vividness of one's own body. But the resources simultaneously are being taken away from those parts of the brain that are constantly involved in this narrative dialogue, right? Each one of us right now is indulging on both. Each one of us right now is partly a bodily self, partly aware of our body, but partly aware that you are sitting in Ohio listening to a talk about the self, right? There is that awareness. There is a story running around, and some of you might actually be somewhere else right now. It's entirely possible. Not a bad thing. It's how the brain works, right? In the seizure, it seems like that part of the self, the narrative self, the thing that goes back and forth in time, is deprived of resources. All of the resources are going into constructing the bodily self and perceiving the environment. And so the narrative component kind of comes to a stop. Not stop entirely, but kind of recedes because it's not that active. And that might explain this paradoxical thing of them feeling as if some boundaries have vanished. Some boundaries have indeed vanished because our narrative self, our psychological self, the stories that we are another form in which the self creates boundaries. And at least those boundaries have vanished, right? But they are nonetheless really aware of their bodies and their physical self. I won't go into the actual neurobiological mechanisms that scientists are speculating as to why this might be so, but I'll tell you that there's preliminary evidence of how you can actually stimulate a certain part of the brain to create this experience. There is a very specific part of the brain called the insular cortex. Even within the insular cortex, another specific part called the left anterior insula, and that seems to be where a lot of this integration and the subjective experience of being a body is somehow happening. And I'm talking about these terms rather loosely. I mean, if neuroscientists would probably throw up at the way I'm describing it, but this is just to keep it sort of conversational. But there is that integration happening, and and it seems to be that the seizure is affecting that part of the brain. And there was a patient in France who she used to suffer from epileptic seizures that were really resistant to drugs. And when people have seizures that knock them unconscious, but they're not responding to drugs, oftentimes surgeons have to perform sort of open brain surgery. They literally have to implant, not open brain, but they have to sort of cut open a little part of the brain and implant electrodes that they can then stimulate and record from in order to figure out where the epilepsy begins, so that they can then surgically take out a little bit of the epileptogenic tissue. But when patients normally have their brains sort of implanted with electrodes, they also agree to be stimulated with those very same electrodes voluntarily for the sake of science, because then you can sort of stimulate this part of the brain, that part of the brain. And we have learned a lot from patients who have voluntarily agreed to have their brain stimulated while being conscious, so that neurosurgeons can figure out which part of the brain does what. And when in one of these surgeries, it turned out that an electrode placed near the left anterior insula would immediately create for the patient this feeling of kind of an ecstatic seizure, an aura. And it was very dramatic for the surgeon, because normally the patient was a very difficult patient for many reasons, not least for the fact that she was undergoing surgery, but there were other things about her that were difficult, and the instant the stimulation was done in the left anterior insula, her face would relax. And so there's obviously some direct correlation with what's happening in that part of the brain with the phenomenology of ecstatic epilepsy, right? So am I one with the universe? You can think about that question, right? Is the I something larger? The last one I want to talk about is something called Cotard syndrome. Now this is a very, very rare condition. Probably in recorded scientific literature, about 100 to 200 people have been mentioned, and even fewer, maybe about 2 or 3 have been studied, inside scanners, and all that has been happening in the last 3 or 4 years. So what is how many of you know what Cotard syndrome is? So Cotard syndrome, just like each one of us right now, if we're asked, do you exist? We'll probably say yes. We hopefully will say yes. A person with Cotards will insist he or she doesn't exist. And this delusion of non-existence is so strong that you can't rationally argue them out of the delusion. Like one of the neurologists I interviewed for this, who was treating a patient with Cotards, would talk about how the patient would insist. The story begins with the neurologist getting a phone call from his secretary at the hospital saying, doctor, can you come down? There is a guy here who says he's dead. I mean, think about that, just right. So he's getting a phone call about a guy who's come to the, I think it was ER, I forget where exactly in the hospital, but that was the phone call. And the patient would insist he is brain dead. There was a very particular kind of death he thought he had experienced, which is brain death. When you think about it, brain death is a kind of death that has become part of our cultural knowledge about what death means only in the last 20 years or so. Before that, brain death was not such a keenly identified idea. So he had a very specific notion of death, and his neurologist would say, you can hear me. He said, yes, I can hear you, and you can see me, you can understand what I'm saying, and he would say yes to all those questions, and the neurologist would say then that, oh, this means that you have a brain, and he says yes, this means that you have a mind, and the patient would say, yes, my mind is fine, and then the neurologist would say, well, if you have a mind, surely you have a brain, and he says, no, my brain is dead. He was convinced he was dead, and the conviction of being dead, of not existing, is so strong that they do things like plan their own funerals. In the case of this patient, he would go spend time in graveyards because that's where he felt he was near people like him who had passed on. After I wrote my book and the hardcover came out, I got a letter from a gentleman who said, after reading about Cotard syndrome, I finally understood what my father was going through. His father apparently was in the late stages of Alzheimer's, and at one day, he basically told his son, look, I'm going to die tomorrow, and you can't tell your mother about all these things because she'll be really upset, but you have to know that I'll be dead. And the next day he was insisting that he should be taken to the cemetery, and somehow they convinced him that he should go to the doctor to get a death certificate because the cemetery wouldn't take him otherwise, and they managed to take him there and medicated him, and the condition resolved, and he stopped feeling like he didn't exist. But this is a real thing. People experience this, so it calls into question what it means. You really have to ask yourself what it means. And it turns out in the case of the couple of patients who have been scanned to see what's happening in their brains at that time, they're saying they don't exist. One of the things that's happening is parts of the network that are responsible for giving us a very, very good sense of our own body and emotional states. It's called the internal awareness network. Those parts of the brain that right now are allowing you to feel your own body states. The activity in that network kind of dampens down tremendously in Cotard's, but that's by itself not enough to cause this condition. You have to have another set of damages to the brain where your ability to rationalize also is impaired, so that the first level of damage has to do with the internal awareness network. So because the body states are not being perceived as vividly as normally, it gives rise to a perception in their brains that I don't exist, because normally existence by definition is being vividly connected to your own body. So they have that perception, and if their rational faculties were intact, they would have been able to shoot down this rather irrational delusion that arises. But because they have damage also to those parts of the brain that can rationally help argue themselves out of this, they're not able to do that either. So that's one explanation for what might be happening, and there are at least two cases where the scans have been done which show this kind of two-factor problem, where on one hand you have damages to those parts of the brain that might be responsible for creating a perception of your own body, and damage to the parts of the brain that then can help you argue out of that perception. So both damages exist simultaneously. And in the case of this fellow who wrote in, his father was in late stage Alzheimer's, and some of these things were happening because of Alzheimer's, these kind of multiple kinds of disruptions to putting together the self. Right? Now again, who or what is it that says I don't exist? Now obviously the I is not the same thing. You can be someone who says I exist, you can be also someone who says I don't exist. Obviously the I is not the same as saying this feeling of existence. There is some experiencing entity again that we need to explain, right? We don't know what that is. So, it brings me to the last couple of slides, which is we really have to explain the I. In all these conditions, what you saw was that no matter how severe the condition, there was always an I experiencing the condition, right? There was always an experiencer behind those conditions. One of the things that is impossible to do, at least to the best of my knowledge, with this kind of analysis, is we have really assume that in these set of slides we saw 8 different ways in which you can tease apart the self. We took emotions apart, narrative self, etc., etc. Now assume that there are 20, hypothetically 20 sum total of sort of characteristics that make up the self. And in each of these conditions, you kind of disrupting one aspect of it and asking the question, what is the I? What this doesn't tell you is what would happen if all 20 for some reason, or the sum total of what makes us, for some reason got disrupted. Will there still be an I? This kind of analysis does not answer that question, right? So when I keep saying there is still an I experiencing schizophrenia, there is still an I experiencing depersonalization. Yes, somebody with schizophrenia has lost certain aspects of their self, but the other aspects are still there. And maybe those other aspects are enough to give the sense of an I, to experience sort of lack of agency of thoughts, lack of agency of actions, etc. And similarly for each of those other conditions. So, and essentially what this analysis allows you to do is you come to a point where you start understanding what is it that philosophers, neurologists and theologians argue about when they're talking about, is there a self or not? They're talking about this subjectively. They're talking about this notion of what is it that experiences, right? And that's where they break down into broadly these categories. One is the bundle theories. We saw that when we talked of David Hume, the idea that all we are is a bundle of perceptions, and if you take away all these perceptions, there is no center that's sitting around saying, I am experiencing these perceptions or I'm not. If you take away the perceptions, it's all gone, right? That's David Hume. A lot of Buddhist thinking follows that kind of logic. They would argue that all we are, the sense of an I, comes about because of an interaction of all the psychophysical elements that make us up, right? Take that away and there is no center. Right? There is no experiencer sitting there experiencing something or not experiencing something. So those are bundle theories. There are what can be called self theorists who argue that there must be some mental construct that comes into existence before all else, to which everything else can be referred. Remember, we were talking about that unity, diachronic unity, synchronic unity, positing the existence of a self to which things must happen. So even though most of these self theories don't necessarily argue that this self is independent of the material body, they still argue for the idea that something in the brain-body continuum must come into existence first, to which things can be referred and made to feel like a coherent whole. So that's sort of the notion of the self that they're arguing for. There are others who will say, well, all that the self is moments of consciousness strung together. Now, we're not going to get into debates about the nature of consciousness, but if you take consciousness as something that has a property called reflexivity, that each moment of consciousness is aware of itself, not saying that there is a person underneath it, none of that. Just a moment of consciousness, whatever that might be, has the property of being reflexive without being attributed to you or you or you. Then you can imagine a brain that takes all these moments of consciousness and somehow strings together the larger person, right? So some philosophers will argue that that's all the self is. It's consciousness which has the property of reflexivity, and all we are is just a string of conscious moments strung together, and that's all it is, right? So I talked about bundle theorists and the Buddhists. The Buddhists would mostly fall into the bundle theory idea that there is really no self. All you are is a bundle of perceptions and psychophysical elements. Consciousness as self, some of you who kind of follow the Advaitin philosophy, the non-dualist ideas, would recognize that in that particular idea, which is that there is what they would call a witness consciousness, a consciousness that is impersonally experiencing everything without regard to who or what, and the individuals are constructed out of these, these experiences which are actually being had by the so-called witness consciousness. That's their idea. Now you can see that not everyone can be right. So right? That's the thing to keep in mind, that these are all ideas, that these are not empirically supported at this point. We have come, we've stepped away now from empirical evidence and started arguing about philosophy and theology, and who knows who's right. So, but this is what they're arguing about, and we'll find out. I wanted to make one small point. Both sort of Buddhist philosophy and Advaitin philosophy really came about because they were trying to address the nature of human suffering. They didn't come up with philosophies first and then it was the other way around. They were really concerned about human suffering. And I found this quote in a book on the self. I really like it and I want to share that with you. The Buddhist would say, our mistake lies in taking there to be one thing when there are really the many. The many in this case being perceptions. All the material things that make up our bodies, right? So all that stuff that's interacting gives rise to this appearance of one, and we take that to be something permanent and solid. The Advaitin would say, our mistake lies in taking there to be a many when strictly speaking there is just the one. And again, both can't be right, so, or maybe they are, and I have no idea, and right? So, yeah. And in case you're wondering where the shoes came from, the shoes was in the book cover. So I'll just leave you with those quotes, and that's all from me. Thank you. Do you have time for questions? Pardon? We have?
Could you please bring about
Ecstatic epilepsy?
Epilepsy.
Okay, I need my sense of agency back, Jaime. Yeah.
Could you tell me what do you mean by epilepsy?
Epilepsy is just very heightened electrical activity in some part of the brain tissue. So it's literally like an electrical storm. It disrupts functioning. If it overwhelms the entire cortex, you can be unconscious. So it's just burst of electrical activity that is normally not there.
So there is no negative connotation.
It can be very dangerous.
Huh?
It can be very dangerous. This particular kind of epilepsy,
Why it could be dangerous?
you can be unconscious. If you're walking down the road, if you're driving a car.
See, when you are saying, am I one with...
So this is one particular form of epilepsy. This particular epilepsy is one small region of the brain, but sometimes these focal seizures don't remain focal. The electrical activity starts spreading and it can overwhelm the entire brain. And so normally you would hear these kind of experiences from people who say that they have an aura before their full-blown seizure. The full-blown seizure will knock you unconscious. So if you're driving a car, that's a very dangerous thing to happen. I mean, it's dangerous regardless. If you fall unconscious, but if the seizure is restricted, if this is all the experience, most of them never even go to the doctor. Why would you, right? If it remains here, but unfortunately it doesn't. It can progress and become dangerous.
Why you say dangerous again? I still don't understand.
If you fall unconscious,
you fell unconscious.
You can. If the seizure overwhelms the entire brain instead of remaining confined to that small part of the brain.
To me, you are in a very heightened state of awareness.
So if the seizure remains in the insular cortex, sometimes the seizure doesn't remain confined. It's like electrical activity. If it spreads to the rest of there's a whole part of your brain that's helping you walk and talk and eat. If all of those go, it depends on how restricted the seizure is. And if it's restricted to this, yes, it's very pleasant, it's blissful, and they don't report their experiences to the doctor. They only end up going to the doctor because this has become now pathological and become a problem for them to just function in daily life. And don't pay too much attention to am I one with the universe, because that seems very blissful, but it can become debilitating.
Very quick extension. How is that different from grand mal?
So grand mal is the seizure which overwhelms your entire cortex. You would fall unconscious, yeah. So that's what's called a non-focal seizure. It's just all over the brain. whereas this is a focal seizure, just in a very tiny part of the brain. This can progress to grand mal, and it happens. Have you read Dostoevsky, anyone? So Dostoevsky refers to this a lot because he might have been someone who suffered from, he definitely suffered from grand mal seizures, but he also used to have ecstatic auras before going unconscious. So when he would write about this, especially fictionalizing it in his characters, you can see the elements of these experiences. Sorry, who's next? Someone needs.
When the child is diagnosed with autism in the early ages, when he grows a little bit bigger, like 20, 25 years,
Right.
Can you explain me how the side effects will be and how the changes in the brain?
First of all, autism is a very diverse kind of spectrum of, conditions. So you can't. It's very hard to say how any one individual would change over their lifetime. But one of the things that happens is, if recognized early and if they undergo certain kinds of therapies, they develop compensatory skills. So for instance, one of the things that's impaired in autism is something called theory of mind, this ability that we all have to be able to infer what's happening in someone else's mind. Right? You just kind of read body cues, like I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, you're looking really bored at what I'm saying. Probably not. So anyway, right? So yeah, he's very focused. So there, my theory of mind wasn't working too well. I couldn't read into his. But the idea is that we all have this ability to look at other people, their facial expressions, their bodily cues, all sorts of unconscious cues, and a perception arises within us about what the other person might be thinking. It might be right or wrong, but nonetheless a perception arises. In autism, unfortunately, that ability is impaired, which is what leads to sort of problems with relating socially to others, because if you can't do that, then it's one of the prerequisites of being able to relate to someone, that you are able to have a sense for what the other person is thinking. Again, right or wrong is not the issue, that there is some ability, and you better be right most of the time, otherwise it'll get problematic. In autism, that's impaired, but what happens is people with autism learn to use cognitive skills to compensate for this. So if you did not have this unconscious sort of implicit ability to read someone else's mind, you can use you can develop a cognitive ability that requires consciously thinking about it, but it's also extremely exhausting. So partly why they don't want to be doing that all the time. One of my sources who talked about how it felt, he had developed this ability, he could do this, but he said that, look, for me, half an hour of being in a social setting is more tiring than 3 hours of writing a calculus exam. So it is tiring because they are engaging cognitive faculties that normally are being used for other things. So, but it can be done.
I have just a very brief question. You talked about the identity with the body and when you lose body parts and these kinds of things. I was wondering if you had any input or research around people who are quadriplegics and paraplegics long term. Like I have a very dear friend who's been quadriplegic for 50 years and has no real sense, of the body, but yet still identifies very clearly with having a body.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if anything you researched there.
So, I mean, if the person had amputations and became quadriplegic or paraplegic because of amputations or because of paralysis, that's one thing, because before that event they would have had full body maps, and they certainly relate to their body. No one is saying that they don't relate to their body, but that body map would change. But I don't know if any of you saw Thomas's talk. He didn't talk about it today, but in the lecture a week ago, he mentioned this patient that he knew who was born without arms and legs. But she felt her arms and legs throughout her life. So in a manner of speaking, her body maps in the brain developed incongruently with the physical body. So she ended up having a sense of her limbs, but not actually having those limbs. So it can go either way, really.
So I have a question about...
the mic is out there. Sorry.
You've heard of yogis for centuries having out-of-body experiences. Does that make any sense to you?
In the context of this, yes, it does. I think, I have talked to people who meditate a lot, who can induce these experiences. So, I'll give you my mechanistic sense of how it might be happening. If our in-body experience depends on the brain working hard every moment in order to integrate all the senses to create this sense of being in the body, you can imagine, meditative practices disrupting that integration, and you can have an outer body experience. Extreme stress will do that. One of my sources again was a woman who talked about how she was having a natural childbirth, without painkillers, and the pain was so intense that she left her body and watched the delivery from. And this is actually extremely painful situations. There are often times when people experience this. It might be the body's protective mechanism against severe pain. This is speculation on my part, but you can neurobiologically explain, even yogis, or without resorting to anything mystical or esoteric. It's basically rewiring temporarily the things that your brain is doing. Right? Who's next? He's got the microphone. I'm not in control.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any explanations about the status of a brain of someone who is experiencing samadhi, like a yogi.
I'm sorry. No, I don't. I didn't look at it. I don't know what that would be like.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was my question.
I mean, there are people out here in front who want to.
So this seems like an analysis of fragmented identification, right? And we went through a series of different types of fragments, and it seemed like you concluded with two philosophies which try to unify the fragmentation in two ways. One, either by denying the fragments, or the other one kind of unifying all fragments as being the part of the, of the whole.
Not quite. I mean, I don't think anyone denies. First of all, when we talk of whether there is a self or not, no one denies the fact that our so-called phenomenal self, the fact that we have the experience of being a self, is real. Of course that is real. None of us would say that it feels unreal to us. It can feel unreal in conditions like depersonalization, but that's a slightly different notion of non-reality. But the experience of being a phenomenal self is absolutely real. So no one is denying these fragments are, exist, etc. The question is, if you think of the experience of being a self as something that is constituted of different parts, and if one of these parts goes away, then we can still keep saying, what is the I that remains that experiences the going away of that part? We don't have a way to answer the question, what happens if all these parts go away? Right? Because it's possible that you took out 1 out of 8 parts, the other 7 are good enough to give you a sense of an I, and in all these cases we're kind of playing a jigsaw puzzle, sort of, we're trying to see what happens, and in all these cases the I remains. But the I could be a outcome of the fact that the other elements of what make up ourself are still interacting and creating the sense of an I. So no one is denying that the fragments phenomenally, as experienced by us, are real. What they are arguing about is the sense of an I. If you took away all the interacting elements, would there still be an I that experiences not having any of these elements, or would the I just go away? Right? That's the debate.
So just on the last slide you have Buddhism and Advaita. So I'm wondering what would Kay say, after all this analysis?
I would leave that to all of you to ponder. Because, yeah.
I was going off of the question I think Srinivas asked, which was around yogis having this kind of experience, and you mentioned how it can be explained by the brain. Now I was wondering what we see in the brain is a material basis of the phenomena, right?
Yeah.
Now, but how do we assume that there is again something outside of that material basis that's causing that material phenomena to happen?
I personally don't assume there's anything outside the brain causing that phenomena. So the onus is really on people who say there is something outside the brain to say what that might be, right? I mean, this is not to knock down any theory, because like I said, the last slide where those different theories for the I, it's not resolved. So is consciousness something immaterial? Is consciousness just sort of the workings out of the brain and nothing more? Those are open questions. And after having looked at this for a few years now, and after talking to philosophers and neuroscientists, I think my personal sense is that it's all material. That the immateriality of consciousness is an illusion. And somehow our task as people who are trying to understand this is to explain why the illusion comes about, not why something immaterial comes about. Because the immateriality is not there. Everything is material, right? But there are others who would argue that no, consciousness is something immaterial. That it arises out of the workings out of the brain, but nonetheless it is something immaterial. It's a small proportion of people who would argue that, but those are all theories that are up there being debated. I don't think the empirical evidence at this point can resolve that question.
Right. In fact, the last slide that you put up, clearly the Advaitin philosophy would sort of posit a non-material basis.
Exactly. So
right?
Advaitin philosophy is saying that there is a larger self with a capital S that is the experiencer of all things. They call it the witness consciousness, right? So their substrate, so in a sense, the ontology of the world, the things that they think make up the world, includes that self. The Buddhist philosophies, the dominant ones, don't. Neither does much of sort of current Western thinking. So, yeah. One or two more.
Going from empirical evidence being direct, like what you are saying, empirical evidence, and I'm now talking about two very different, because let's say Buddhism, which talks about the Eightfold Path and how you should behave. Supposedly Buddha, that state of had one. What to his followers to go and reach that state, that eightfold path. And with Christianity and 10 Commandments, there seems to be some similarity between the common morality advocated by two very, very different prophets who might have described their experiences in very different way. So how does this indirect empirical evidence, which seems to be more congruent than the direct empirical evidence, tie in with all that you are saying?
I can only give you a personal sort of take on that. There is obviously, to me, what all these sort of instructions on how you can live are really ways in which you can lessen the hold of the conceptual self. So if you think back to ecstatic epilepsy, the sort of oneness, the notion of oneness comes about seemingly because much of what's happening is being in the brain is being focused on being present, in this case involuntarily, but nonetheless that's what's happening. There is a kind of a strong sense of presence here and now, and the chatter in the brain, that is our narrative self, seems to be sort of dampened down. And for me personally, what all these things like Buddha's Eightfold Path, whatever you might look at, which are trying to get to that state, I think they're all trying to make us less of less of a narrative and more of just being embodied. And I don't want to say anything more because it gets into a whole bunch of debates that I am not either equipped or ready to have, but that's how I think about it. So if you start analyzing even what Kay said in that context, it might start making sense. Yeah.
The very first slide that you presented on synchronic and diachronic.
Yeah.
And the diachronic thing, based on what you said, is based on past memories from a very young age or whatever.
Yeah, whatever your
experiences.
Yeah.
But can it also be extended to a kind of timelessness, a timeless experience one has? That is question number one. Question number two, all this that is listed as ecstatic epilepsy, we also find with the experiences of J. Krishnamurti and many other philosophers and
yes.
Saints and whatnot.
Yes.
So is it to say that any kind of this heightened awareness will give you this, as opposed to, I mean, I'm not saying ecstatic epilepsy is heightened awareness, but heightened awareness would definitely be this plus a lot more.
If you read what mystics say about their experience, they may not say all these things at the same time, but these are components of their experiences. Certainly, slowing down of time, feeling of oneness with something larger, definitely feelings of bliss and physical and mental well-being, feelings of certainty, feeling of divinity, right? Are mystics having seizures? I mean, I have no way of knowing. I don't think, unless we put them in a scanner and they're willing to be. I think one of the things that, are sort of offline discussions is that there's also this question of functioning like this throughout the day. Someone with seizure is not in that state. So this should be just suggestive of something, right? And it's up to us to now take this. At the very least, for what it does for me is it makes me question anyone's claim about that they're seeing the truth, because you've seen, why shouldn't I take the person with Cotard's experience as I don't exist as the truth? It's the truth for him, right? Just as each one of us is completely convinced we exist, he's convinced he doesn't exist. Why is my truth better than his truth? So why is someone who's saying they're in touch with divinity, why is their truth more real? To me, that's a fundamental message about our neuroscientific understandings today, is that question everyone's assertion about what they're perceiving, because what neuroscience is telling us is that we are always perceiving a simulation of reality, not reality. Always, including your body right now. So, okay.
One more question, Anil. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's from Rob. He's viewing this online, and his question is, who is doing the best work on schizophrenia, and is there any progress being made?
There's a lot of people doing. I'll have to go back, and it depends on what aspects of schizophrenia. It's such a diverse set of conditions that, when a diagnosis of schizophrenia is made, the person can be suffering from a whole range of things, and depending on who the researcher is, they might be looking at different things. So you're welcome to put me in touch with him, and then we can take it offline. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.